that truly was a generous introduction. I thank you for it. I really want to, first of all, I should say good afternoon to all of you. I see a few one-talks from Papua New Guinea in the group, and up in Turulong Yupala as well. It's nice to see you. I really do want to thank the Centre for Social Responsibility in Mining and also Matt, the School of Political Science and International Studies, for this invitation to speak at my own old university about Papua New Guinea, our dynamic, and that's a key word, dynamic nearest neighbour. As you've just heard, the 25 years since I left this place have involved, among quite a number of other things, service as Australian Ambassador to the Federal Republic of Germany and Australian High Commissioner to the independent state of Papua New Guinea. Now, when it was announced in 2009 that I'd been posted directly from Berlin to Port Moresby, several people I know from different walks of life, doctors, real estate agents, family friends, were moved to ask whom I had offended. But those who work, and this is a serious point, those who work in the field of national security and international policy, and pretty much all of my colleagues in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade were more inclined to ask whom I had slept with. I don't want you thinking for a minute that latter technique is accepted or even common practice in advancing your career aspirations in DFAT. The truth is much more straightforward. Towards the end of my time, in fact, for a lot of the latter period of my time in Berlin, I asked persistently and consistently if I could go to Papua New Guinea, and the government made a judgment that I could be trusted to do that job. So off I went. And there is a serious point in that. And it's something I want to spend just a minute on as I begin this presentation. It really is generally understood by those who work in the field of Australian foreign policy that Papua New Guinea matters to Australia at a fundamental level, and often, as I've experienced in the last 3 years, in a very immediate way. The best of our young graduate entrants, and a number of them come from this university, will lobby very hard once they've found their way into the organisation to go to places like Papua New Guinea or Indonesia on their first overseas postings. And I do have to say that in the 25 years that I have been in the Foreign Service, the best staff quality I have had has been on this last posting in Port Moresby. I think it's partly because they know it'll be good for their professional credibility within the service, but also because they're impatient to do work that matters. Because it's in places like Papua New Guinea and Indonesia and Solomon Islands and East Timor where our national interests are in clearest profile, where the security, prosperity and good governance of the host country contribute directly to the stability of the region that we inhabit. Now, yes, there's a lot more to the world than those key regional relationships I've just mentioned. And yes, successful diplomatic careers can be built in many, many different ways. But I think mainstream Australia does probably need to understand better the importance of the neighbourhood. And as a society, we need to act more like we understand it. One of the key findings of the recently released Australia in the Asian Century White Paper was that as a community, government, business, academia, we need to develop and nurture greater expertise about the Asia-Pacific region. It seems almost incredible to me, because we've discovered the region so many times in our recent history, it seems almost incredible to me that we have to say this to ourselves in 2013. But the sad truth is that what we might describe as our regional literacy is well below where it should be. I know I'm speaking to the converted in this room, but by the measure of regional literacy, even some of our universities have seen better days. So I want to sort of make that point as I open. I want to say that the size and the breadth of the Australian government's own official presence in Papua New Guinea really does reflect the level of importance that is attached to it by the Australian government. The Australian aid program in Papua New Guinea, worth $500 million Australian dollars this year, is second only in value, and only just that, to our development program in Indonesia, a country of enormously larger population. There are 300 men and women working at the Australian High Commission in Papua New Guinea, including 100 posted from Australia. And if you include the additional 70 federal government officials who are working on secondment with PNG agencies, Moresby is by far Australia's largest official presence overseas globally. So that's something that people don't always understand, but it certainly reflects importance. It reflects the breadth of things we do there. That, of course, is only the official relationship. If you take a step back and you look at Australia-PNG relations from a broader perspective, there are tens of thousands of Australians who have a personal link with the country. I am myself a member of what I might often describe as a tribe of Australians who have a very sort of strong personal link with PNG. As my Papua New Guinean Wontalks know, I grew up in the country, and like many thousands of other Australians, I had a pre-independence childhood there. And so there's plenty of people like me, but the connections that that tribe have with Papua New Guinea tell us a lot about our histories and how those histories are intertwined with each other. There's people like me, there's others whose links are even more historical, whose links reach back to perhaps when a grandfather fought in the savage battles of Kokoda or Milne Bay or Sananda or Gona during World War II. And by the way, many thousands more, about 3,000 more each year, add themselves to this tribe by walking the Kokoda track. It's become a rite of passage. People do it for different reasons. Sometimes it's a desire to honour the past. Often it's a desire to test their own personal endurance. My consistent observation is that people who emerge from the process find that they've established some kind of lasting link with the people of PNG. It has that effect on them. It has an effect of getting under the skins of Australians. And of course there's about 15,000 Australians working today right across the country in fields as diverse as development, in mining and banking. The economic relationship is very substantial. To most people's surprise, the trade relationship is actually in Papua New Guinea's favour, not ours. Gold has a lot to do with that, but there's more to it than that. Trade's worth about 8 billion in Australian. There's considerable investment flows in both directions. Look at property investment in Cairns and Brisbane, and you'll begin to understand the story of Papua New Guinea and investment in this state. And it takes a lot of people and a lot of connection to sustain all of this. So there's all of that, but paradoxically, PNG is a blind spot for many Australians. There's many who'd have trouble placing it on a map, and others who've heard only dark stories about violence and the law and order situation. It's a shame that that low level of understanding is sometimes the case here in this state of Queensland, whose northernmost islands are less than 4 kilometres from the Papua New Guinean mainland. Conversely, many in this country would be astonished by the extent to which Papua New Guineans understand what makes us tick as Australians. They are closely familiar, not just the middle class, but they're closely familiar with our politics, our culture, and believe me, the personal histories of every member of the Australian National Rugby League. It's no joke. To digress for a moment, the only time I've ever felt anything like a rock star was walking out into Port Moresby with the Australian Rugby League team late last year. As we walked out, they cried out everybody's name except mine. It was an extraordinary experience. But look, given what we often hear about the wildness and savagery of the country through the media, there's another point about Papua New Guineans. Many Australians would also be surprised by their warmth and generosity. The stories are legion of expatriates finding themselves in some kind of difficulty in Papua New Guinea, in the wilds of Papua New Guinea. Car breaks down, vehicle goes into ditch, and suddenly a very large group of people emerge from nowhere. Now this is something which to the newcomer can be slightly alarming, but they will invariably only be anxious to get you on your way. And exactly this happened to me, one of my sort of key moments in my last 3 years. The August before last, when the vehicle carrying a group of us, me and a bunch of young, quite attractive Australian women who all worked at the High Commission, in the back of a Land Rover, the vehicle that we were in found itself stuck in the middle of a raging torrent on the island of Bougainville. I had just been earlier that morning the first Australian High Commissioner in since 1989 to visit the Panguna mine, the place where all the trouble began. And there we were, caught in the middle of a raging river. I struggled manfully to the bank while my young colleagues were each plucked dry from the vehicle by random strangers, people who just turned up and deposited safely on the bank. Our worldly effects were handed again into the hands of perfect strangers and found 5 minutes later, safely stored and secured in shelter from the rain. It was a very common experience. It's a very common experience for Australians in Papua New Guinea, and it stands beside some of the realities of law and order, which I would not want to seek to downplay. But look, you probably didn't notice the subtitle of this presentation, the subtitle I gave this is Winning a Better Future for Our Closest Neighbour. In imagining the future, we do need to understand the present, so let's have a quick talk about that. There's no doubt that Papua New Guinea's current circumstances can be improved upon. There's a lot happening there though, and it's the dynamics of the country that I think we are missing out on for the large part here in Australia. The economy is growing really fast, fuelled by significant growth in the resources sector, including particularly the construction over the last 3 years of a $16 billion LNG project. PNG was the 7th fastest growing economy in 2011. It was in the same league last year, a year that sealed a decade of uninterrupted expansion. It's estimated to have grown by a further 9% last year, more growth expected for this year. So more wealth at the disposal of Papua New Guineans, at least in theory, and that has to be a good thing, despite the dangers and the risks that go with it. Demographics tell an important part of the story too. The population's growing by as much as 3%. Official figures are 2.7%, but frankly people think that they're pretty low, and statistics are difficult to be firm about in Papua New Guinea. So the population of the country is about 7 million now. 40% of the people are below the age of 15. By 2030, the population will be estimated to grow to 10 million, and serious projections are that Papua New Guinea will have a population approaching that of contemporary Australia by 2050. Now, that begins to help us understand what a future Papua New Guinea might look like, but there's a lot more to the story. Let's talk about politics. Papua New Guinea's emerged stronger from a prolonged political and constitutional crisis than it has been for some time. And the situation as far as political stability is concerned is pretty good right now. Let's quickly talk about what has happened. Many of you will have some understanding, some sense of what happened in a period which was literally a year and a day of crisis in Papua New Guinea. We had a bitter intergenerational struggle that began in late 2011 between two rivals for the Prime Minister's position. The elderly Michael Somare, often referred to as the father of independence in Papua New Guinea, on one hand, and Peter O'Neill, the representative of a new generation of Papua New Guineans, on the other. A new generation that has been increasingly impatient to carve out a new kind of future for the country. We all recall the headlines in the Australian media about two rival Prime Ministers, two Defence Force commanders, police chiefs, Speakers of Parliament and even Governors General. As many Papua New Guineans explained in mock pride, we have two of everything. O'Neill was always in a stronger position. He enjoyed the solid support of Parliament and, to a large extent, the people. But it took an election in June-July to give real legitimacy to him and to bring that difficult issue to a successful close. And so this is why we're concerned when in the first half of last year, prior to that election, negative forces in Parliament, motivated, frankly, by sheer self-interest, were working hard to prevent that election from happening. If they'd been successful, it would have been a dark day for Papua New Guinea, which, despite everything, has managed to pull off an election every 5 years since independence. Believe me, no small thing for a country with the topography and population of Papua New Guinea, in accordance with its constitution. Ultimately, common sense and that key Melanesian cultural principle, consensus, prevailed. We learned some important positive things about Papua New Guinea in the process, and it might be counterintuitive to you, but I actually think that that crisis overall was a positive story for Papua New Guinea. The leadership of the armed forces and the police remained neutral and stayed out of it, despite repeated attempts by political factions to involve them directly in the conflict. The population remained calm throughout. Local civil society made it clear that democracy, respect for the constitution were important principles. And to give us a plug, in its own approach to the crisis, I really do think that the Australian government, and yes, they relied heavily on me and my colleagues for advocacy and for judgment about how to handle it, I really do think that we got it right. We spoke clearly when things threatened to go off the rails. We left the megaphone in the cupboard, and we did it privately. Our politicians accepted my advice not to get out in public about it. It was their instinct to be fair. And we were more persuasive, we were more effective for that reason. We, importantly, in a very positive, constructive way, encouraged national confidence that a successful election could be held despite the difficult circumstances by offering and providing unprecedented military and civilian logistical support for the poll. My High Commission, the official presence, about doubled in size during that period. But look, returning to the theme, after what was a really rocky period, the political environment really is now quite positive. O'Neill now leads a government with fresh energy and determination, and one of his most significant coalition partners is Michael Somare. And that's something that's hard to understand, perhaps difficult to grasp until you really do grasp at a fundamental level the importance of reconciliation and consensus in Melanesian society. If you understand that point, you understand better what has happened in Papua New Guinea over the last couple of years. Following changes to the constitution that were finalised in January, political stability is actually guaranteed for the next 30 months. Now, this is something we've not experienced in Papua New Guinea for a very long time. So let's take stock for a minute. When combined, those factors I've described so far, economic and population growth, generational succession, growing political strength, have clear implications for broader regional dynamics. PNG wants to take on a more strong, clearer leadership role in Papua New Guinea, in the Pacific rather. We've seen PNG begin to exert a more influential role in relation to Fiji. Papua New Guinea's for many years now been a significant troop contributor to the regional assistant mission in the Solomon Islands. We've now got small presences, sure, but we do have Papua New Guinean military observers attached to the United Nations in Darfur and South Sudan. No matter what you might think of it, Papua New Guinea's declared public position in relation to the regional processing centre on Manus Island is that as a serious regional country, Papua New Guinea has a serious role to play in addressing a serious regional problem. If you don't accept that position, you can at least accept that that is the self-perception and the self-understanding of Papua New Guineans. The new leadership of Papua New Guinea grew up in an independent Papua New Guinea. That and the new wealth of the country make them more confident in dealing with Australia and more inclined to be selective in their international dealings. taking each external relationship on its merit. Now that's something that we just have to understand and accept and work with. Meanwhile, the new dynamics in the country have attracted growing levels of interest on the part of the United States, China, and other external powers. Again, something natural and something to work with. So, if we imagine the future shape of PNG, we can imagine a country with a significant larger economy, a population approaching that of contemporary Australia, led by people more confident in dealing with the world, including us. But before we get carried away with what is a pretty robust vision of PNG, let's have a more sober look at the situation inside the country, within the country. It can often seem truly overwhelming. PNG is struggling to translate growth into tangible benefits for the great majority of its people, fueling a widening gap between rich and poor. Infrastructure, hospitals, schools have declined very significantly over the years. The accessibility of education is improving. It's a positive story, but we have to worry about quality. Maternal mortality is one of the scandals of Papua New Guinea, and every Papua New Guinean leader will tell you this. I'm not saying anything controversial here. At 750 plus deaths for every 100,000 births, PNG has the shame of being a world leader, certainly a regional leader, as far as this is concerned. It means 5 mothers are dying every day in Papua New Guinea completely unnecessarily. And it has a lot to do with lack of supervision of birth, and it's something, by the way, that the Australian aid program's trying to do something about. Preventable diseases remain widespread. We hear a lot about tuberculosis in this state, tuberculosis state in PNG in this state, but truth is that while tuberculosis is a serious problem, there are many other diseases that are also serious problems, and Western Province, the area adjoining Papua New Guinea, is not the only part of Papua New Guinea where this is a problem. Parts of the country, an important part of the country, namely the autonomous region of Bougainville, is still recovering from the most serious conflict the Pacific has seen since the Second World War, and its future status within the country is uncertain. More generally, the security situation, which is misunderstood outside PNG and which is often distorted, does remain a significant impediment to the development of PNG. Now, you're probably expecting me to talk a bit about what the Australian aid program is doing to fix all this, and I will talk a little bit about it, but there's a more serious point than that. I do think, I'm not a creature of the aid program, but I really do think that Australians can be and should be quite pleased with what their aid program is doing in Papua New Guinea these days. Among many other things, it's saved thousands of lives in the last couple of years by delivering essential medicines to the more than 2,700 functioning remote aid posts and hospitals in the country. We're training hundreds of midwives through the aid program in PNG with Australian mentoring and training. Very impressive women, each of them, to help address that problem I just mentioned before, the problem of maternal mortality. We're making education more accessible to Papua New Guineans through significant subsidies to the education department, building hundreds of classrooms, delivering millions of textbooks. So there's some quite serious stuff that's happening, but it's actually not my main point, because if I was to bang on about the Australian aid program anymore, I'd be missing what is the key point, and that is that no external aid program, including Australia's very significant one, is actually going to bring about lasting change in Papua New Guinea. It will not come from outside. It might sound trite, but change will only come from within. It will only come with Papua New Guinean leadership. Papua New Guineans certainly want more from their own government. They know money's not the problem. They know that administrative capacity, and let's call it what it is, corruption, are the true constraints. Now, a core ingredient for success for PNG is for its own government to show a new kind of leadership and to lift its game in service delivery. I'm not being that frank. I could say this and have said this many times in front of Prime Minister Peter O'Neill, because he believes it too. And that's a key point. We have a government in Papua New Guinea that certainly wants to do just what I've described and is working to that end. The challenge before it is enormous. And I think it has to be said that the problem is probably too big for the government to cope with alone. I think the national government of Papua New Guinea, and again I've said this to people directly, need to recognise that other local organisations are often, not always, but often in a stronger position than government itself to deliver important services such as health and education. The churches are a case in point. The churches currently provide at least half of the education and healthcare in PNG, and they provide all of the quality. They're all at it. Taking just randomly the Catholic Church as an example, you have the best quality university in the country, in the Divine Word University in Madang. You have technical education provided through Don Bosco. You have some of the best schools I've ever seen in places like Marionville and De La Salle outside Point Moresby, or Notre Dame outside Mount Hagen. There is a real capacity and a real record there that needs to be paid attention to and worked with. Government funding to boost church-run services should be an important and significant part of the mix in approaching PNG's development. The aid program's certainly doing that. We have something called the Church Partnership Program, where we work closely with the churches and fund the mainstream churches. Conscious of where I'm standing, in the particular building I'm standing in, I think it also needs to be said, but it's true anyway, is that principle of partnership could be applied better in the government's dealings with the corporate sector, particularly the resources industry, which has a great deal of experience and a great deal of capacity to offer in the development process. Most significant resource companies in PNG, to be fair to them, put quite serious effort into sustainability and community development. There's some very interesting examples for corporate social responsibility in PNG. One of the most remarkable is that of the Australian listed company Oil Search, which has become a national provider of HIV/AIDS prevention and treatment services in areas well beyond the area of its commercial operation. It's doing that on behalf of the Global Fund rather than the government of Papua New Guinea, because it's recognised to have a capacity in the area. Donor countries like Australia can certainly help and will continue. I think we will probably need to adjust our own approach as Papua New Guinea develops. There'll be the constant demand to help save lives. Our constituency, our people will expect that they will see direct, concrete, short-term results from our aid program, and that will have to inform our approach. But on the other hand, our focus will need to be, in coming years and now, much more strongly on helping Papua New Guinea unlock its own potential. Now, with that principle in mind, we've been providing PNG with technical support and advice as it works to develop well-governed and independent sovereign wealth funds to channel its mineral and petroleum wealth into development. And I have a strong personal view that education and skills development, universities, by the way, have a very clear role to play here in Australia, will have to be central to our approach as the years unfold. So I do want to pretty much finish there. Let me just say as I conclude that as we go back to the future for a moment of our nearest neighbour, we can only say it hangs in the balance. I'm an optimist, but we have to say, if we're serious people, that it hangs in the balance. And that it will only be Papua New Guineans themselves who determine whether it's going to be marked by success or by further failure, because there have been failures in the past. I think the most helpful Australian approach is going to have to be one which remains committed to supporting Papua New Guineans who are willing to work in a positive direction, and the good news is there's a lot of them. So, you know, I guess I leave you with that thought. I repeat that I am ultimately an optimist about Papua New Guinea, but the challenges are very serious. Thank you.